Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind had been pressing against the cabin for hours, slipping through the narrow gaps in the old wooden boards and carrying the sharp smell of frozen earth. Elias Thornton stood near the stove, rubbing warmth back into his hands while the lantern on the table flickered with each draft. He kept the room dim to save kerosene, the light stretching just far enough to touch the door and the stack of firewood beside it. When the wind rose again, rattling the latch, he decided it was time to bring the last of the wood inside before the cold grew worse. He pulled on his coat, feeling the familiar stiffness in his left shoulder from a years-old injury, and walked toward the door with slow, measured steps. He didn't hurry anymore. Life out here had stripped the rush out of him. Before opening the door, he paused out of habit, listening. Nothing but the wind scraping over the roof and the faint creak of tree branches. He unlatched the door and opened it just wide enough to slip through, and that was when he froze. A shape lay slumped against the step. At first, he thought it was a bundle of old cloth blown by the wind. Then the lantern light stretched across the doorway, touching skin, tangled hair, and the trembling rise of a breath. A woman. Elias set the firewood down so quickly that one piece rolled across the floor. He crouched, the cold biting through his knees as he leaned closer. The woman lay curled on her side, one arm tucked under her, the other extended toward the threshold, as if she had been reaching for the door when her strength failed. Her bare feet were scraped raw, the skin cracked from cold and rough ground. The hem of her dress was torn, the dirt ground into the seams. Her face was half hidden by her hair, but he saw her eyelids flutter when he touched her shoulder with the back of his hand. Her skin was cold enough to make him tense. "Ma'am," he said, voice quiet but firm, meant not to startle. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened a little, unfocused at first, then widening with fear the moment she saw him. She tried to push herself up, but her arm shook uncontrollably, and she couldn't lift her own weight. Panic flashed through her expression, a short, sharp reaction that reminded Elias of someone running too long with no rest and expecting the worst from whoever found them. "It's all right," he said, keeping his voice steady and low. "You're safe. I'm just getting you out of the cold." He slid his arms under her carefully, noting how light she felt, how she flinched when his hands brushed the rope burns on her wrists. Her breath came fast and uneven, like she feared each second would end in pain. Elias lifted her inside, adjusting his grip when she sagged against him. A wave of cold air followed them through the doorway as he carried her toward the bed near the stove. He lowered her slowly, making sure her head rested against the folded blanket. She watched him with wide, wary eyes, her chest rising quickly under the torn dress. She looked afraid to speak, afraid not to, afraid of what he might demand. Elias took a step back as soon as she was settled. He didn't want her feeling cornered. He reached for another blanket, shook off the dust, and draped it over her shoulders. She held the edges tightly, knuckles pale, as if the blanket itself might be taken from her. "What happened to you?" he asked softly, watching her reaction more than listening for details. Her lips parted, but she hesitated, swallowing hard. "Camp," she whispered. "Forced work? Men, hunting." Her voice broke off there, not from emotion, more like exhaustion cutting her words short. Elias nodded once, accepting what she could give. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't look at her injuries longer than necessary. He kept his focus on practical things, feeding the fire, warming the cabin, closing the door properly to lock out the cold. But inside, his thoughts moved fast and controlled. Forced labor, raiders, pursuit. This wasn't a small matter. Whoever chased her was likely close. His solitude had kept him safe for years, but now someone wounded and hunted lay in his bed. And he wasn't about to put her back out in the cold. He filled a cup with water warmed near the stove and placed it within her reach. She didn't take it immediately. Her eyes flicked from the cup to his face, waiting to see what came next. Elias recognized that look, the kind that came from too much mistreatment, too much expecting danger from every direction. "You don't owe me anything," he said, anticipating the fear behind her hesitation. "Just drink if you can." Her fingers trembled when she picked up the cup. She sipped slowly, coughing once as the warm water hit her throat. Elias watched the rise and fall of her breathing, noting how each inhale steadied a little after the water. When she lowered the cup, her gaze drifted across the room. She took in the layout, the stove, the table, the door, the rifle in the corner, and he could almost see her measuring the distance, checking escape routes, preparing for the worst. It was the same kind of thinking he lived with every day, though for different reasons. He sat on the edge of the chair, near the table, not facing her directly, giving her enough space to feel the room wasn't closing in on her. She pulled the blanket closer and asked, voice barely audible, "You won't hurt me?" "No," Elias said simply. "Not ever." The certainty in his tone surprised even him, but he meant it fully. Asha's shoulders lowered slightly, not relaxed but less rigid. She shifted under the blanket, trying to ease the sharp sting in her scraped feet. Elias stood and fetched a small cloth, dipping it in warm water. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her feet. She hesitated again, then nodded once. He cleaned the worst of the dirt from her skin, careful not to touch more than he had to. She winced a few times but didn't pull back. The longer he worked, the more her breathing slowed, fear giving way to exhaustion. "Rest," he said quietly. "You're safe for now." She lay back against the pillow, her eyes drifting closed but opening every few seconds as if checking he was still across the room and not closer. Elias returned to the table, watching the frost creep across the window as the storm outside strengthened. His heart beat a little harder than usual, not from fear of danger, but from the strange weight of responsibility settling in. He had lived alone for years, shutting the world out to avoid causing harm or bringing trouble back on himself. Now, a half-frozen woman lay in his bed, hunted and terrified, and he was the only barrier between her and whatever she had escaped. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wouldn't let her die at his doorstep. A faint gray light pushed through the small window by the time Asha woke. The inside of the cabin was warmer than the night before, the steady crackle of the stove filling the silence with a calm, rhythmic sound. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Her body tensed, her breath catching her throat, her eyes scanning the room fast. Door, table, stove, shadows. Then she saw Elias. He was standing near the stove, sleeves rolled up slightly, stirring something in a tin pot with slow, even movements. He wasn't looking at her. He hadn't noticed she was awake yet. His posture was quiet, settled, as if he had been standing there for some time, without rushing through anything. Asha pushed herself up on her elbows. The blanket slipped slightly, and she grabbed it fast, pulling it to her chest. The motion made the mattress creak. Elias turned at the sound, and their eyes met. "You're awake," he said, tone steady, not surprised or overly gentle, just clear and calm. "How are you feeling?" She shifted against the pillow, testing her arms, her legs. Everything ached in a dull, constant way. "Hurts," she admitted. Her voice was rough, still carrying the dryness of last night's struggle. He nodded once. "Pain means you're warming up. Better than how I found you." The memory of collapsing at his door flickered across her mind, sharp and disturbing. She tightened her grip on the blanket and looked down. Elias didn't step closer. Instead, he kept his distance, giving her room to breathe. "I've got food heating," he said. "Something light. You haven't eaten in a while." Asha watched him for a long moment. She didn't know his habits yet. She didn't know what he expected or what he might demand. But so far, he hadn't acted like the men from the camp. He hadn't grabbed her. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't spoken in ways that made her flinch. Still, she stayed cautious. "Where am I?" she asked, eyes drifting to the window. "Foot of the northern hills," he answered. "Cabin's mine. Nearest town's half a day east. This place stays quiet." She nodded slowly. Her breathing felt steadier now, the tightness in her chest loosening. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders and eased her legs toward the edge of the bed. Elias set the pot aside and turned toward her. "Take it slow," he said. "You stood yesterday, but your legs won't hold much yet." Asha paused, studying his face carefully. He wasn't lecturing her. He wasn't giving orders. It sounded more like a warning from someone who had seen too many people push themselves too fast. She swung her legs down anyway, testing the floor with her toes. The cold of the woods startled her. Her skin was still tender from the night before, but not as raw. Elias stepped backward, clearing her path toward the table. If you want to sit, the chair's there. I'll bring it over. She rose shakily. For a second, her knees buckled. Elias moved one step forward, ready to catch her, but didn't touch her unless she fell. She steadied herself against the bedpost, breathing through the pain. I'm fine, she said quickly. He didn't argue. He just nodded and kept a respectful distance as she walked slowly to the table. The chair scraped lightly across the floor when she sat, her breath hitching as the soreness in her ribs tightened. Elias ladled steaming broth into a tin cup and set it on the table in front of her. Too hot right now. Give a minute. She wrapped her hands around the cup anyway, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. She hadn't felt something warm in days. She watched the steam rise and then glanced at him again. You don't ask questions, she said quietly. Not unless I need to. What? Questions corner people, he replied, taking a seat across from her, but keeping his posture open, unthreatening. You've been cornered enough. His words struck her in a place she hadn't prepared for. Her throat tightened. She looked away quickly, focusing on the steam. She sipped the broth once it cooled enough. The heat settled into her stomach, easing the trembling that still lingered. Elias watched without staring, giving her the sense he was monitoring her strength, not her behavior. After several minutes of silence, she spoke again. You live alone. Better that way, he said. For you. For everyone. There was something in his tone, quiet, heavy, shaped by regret rather than pride. She didn't pry. She understood the kind of silence someone used to protect a wound that hadn't healed. She finished the broth and set the cup down gently. Thank you. Elias lifted a shoulder in a small shrug. Anyone would have done the same. Asha looked at him directly at that, eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. No, not anyone. He didn't answer. His jaw tightened slightly, as if he didn't know where to put the weight of her honesty. A gust of wind pushed against the cabin, rattling the shutters. Asha flinched, muscles tightening. Elias noticed instantly. Just the wind, he said. Nothing else out there. She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. You're safe for now, he added quietly, the words simple but firm. Not a promise he couldn't keep, just the truth of this moment. And something about the way he said it eased a small piece of the fear she had been carrying since the day she was taken. She leaned back slightly, the blanket slipping lower on her shoulders, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to inhale deeply without expecting to be struck or shouted at. Elias stood, adjusting the stove. If you want to rest more, the bed's yours. I'll stay by the door for a while. Why? She asked. He looked at her with a steady, matter-of-fact expression. Because last night, you nearly froze. And because you're not alone here. Asha lowered her gaze again, not used to safety being stated so plainly. She didn't return to the bed, but she stayed at the table, watching him work, beginning, slowly, to believe that she might survive the next day. The fear was still there. The uncertainty never left her chest. But there was a small, unexpected shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't running. And Elias, though he didn't show much on his face, felt a shift too, an awareness that his quiet life had changed the moment he opened the door last night. A feeling he didn't fight, even if he didn't yet know what it meant. The morning passed quietly, the kind of quiet that carried tension beneath it. Thin sunlight pushed across the frost outside, turning the ground pale where the shadows of the trees didn't touch. Asha rested near the stove, wrapped in the blanket, her legs stretched out carefully. Elias moved in and out of the cabin, tending to chores with a focus that seemed sharper today than yesterday. He didn't explain where he went each time he stepped outside, but Asha watched how he paused before opening the door, listening, measuring the silence, weighing the wind. He wasn't a careless man. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, as if he had lived too long expecting danger. Eventually, curiosity and unease pushed at her. "What are you looking for out there?" she asked when he returned from his third trip. Elias brushed frost from his coat sleeve before answering. "Tracks," he said simply. "Snow's thin enough to show them." Asha's fingers tightened around the blanket. "What kind?" "Boots." "Horses." Her throat tensed. "How many?" "3 riders," he said, lowering himself onto the chair near the table. His face stayed calm, but not relaxed, more like someone who had seen this pattern before.